LoreWarrior Campaign, Kiriten Front, Vega. In the first 6 weeks after the invasion, Vega's defenders had lost 2 of the 3 continents. The 3rd Lyran Guards had pushed Draconis forces back to the eastern half of the large plain of Viewers, near the southern pole. The capital of Vega, Neukölln, but precious little else, was still under Draconis control. Then, in October, Colonel Theodore Kirita arrived at Vega in a reverse of the steps he'd taken to leave Marthik. Detaching from the hijacked scout jumpship, his dropship executed a high-speed approach to the planet. Before being properly challenged by orbiting Commonwealth dropships, the Union-class vessel was already entering Vega's atmosphere. Draconis forces at least tried to shoot down the Colonel's disguised dropship, unlike the Commonwealth blockade force, which allowed him to skim through without even a warning shot. Once safely with the 2nd and 14th Legions of Vega, he assessed his situation. He was in command of 2 mech regiments and 40 tank and infantry regiments that were in fair condition. Most of his mechs, however, were running low on ammunition and spare parts. The procurement department of the DCMS had never formed caches of supplies, and so there were no parts on the planet. Colonel Kirita's appearance did provide an emotional lift to the Draconis forces already there. Colonel Kirita knew he couldn't count on help. He and Warlord Vasily Cherenkov, commander of the Lyran district, didn't get along, and had a history of arguments and traded insults. Cherenkov was quite fond of pompous exhortations to Theodore to live up to the dragon's blood that flows within and avoid embarrassing displays of humanity. Against such invective, it wasn't surprising that Theodore Kirita decided to rely on his own resources rather than ask for help and face Cherenkov's disdain. Not only did Colonel Kirita intend to survive here, he intended to win. He was going to push the Commonwealth forces off Vega, not out of love or duty, but out of spite. He was going to prove to his father and to Cherenkov that he could do something they could never do: coax the best out of his troops. To do this, Colonel Kirita had to defeat the 3rd Lyran Guards and its attendant regiments. The 3rd Lyrans, a veteran unit used to winning, was very confident of capturing Vega quickly. Much of this confidence was because the Commonwealth controlled the space around Vega, and ground units received daily shipments of supplies and ammunition. Colonel Kirita knew that the Commonwealth had established a major supply depot at Kokos, a coastal city just 20 kilometers from the front line, and within striking distance of the 14th Legion. Destroying the supplies could stall the Commonwealth offensive and would be a major victory, but Colonel Kirita, he wanted to capture the supplies for his own men. On October 17th, during the changing of the guard at the supply depot, a group of natives hired by the Commonwealth as manual labourers threw off their rain ponchos and opened fire. They were Colonel Kirita's personal guard, who had slipped through the Commonwealth lines and reached Kokos with the help of loyal citizens. The surprise here was total, and soon the entire depot was under the Kiritan control. Even the light mech that was guarding the base had been overwhelmed with a crude napalm bomb. As the Kiritans were clearing away bodies and stacking boxes of supplies, a flotilla of hovercraft and ships began to appear in the bay. As the supplies were being loaded aboard the ships, Colonel Kirita was directing skirmishers all along the front to divert the Commonwealth attention away from Kokos, and by the time the first detachment of Lyran tanks and infantry entered Kokos to investigate why the depot wasn't responding to requests from the front lines, most of the supplies had been loaded onto the ships, which were now heading for the legions of Vega. With supplies and spirit replenished, the Vegan forces then awaited the next action. On October 23rd, the Kirita regiments launched a broad offensive. Colonel Kirita sent his vehicles along a network of gullies and waddies, now dry in the summer heat, gaining great tactical advantage over the Lyrans, who had mistakenly believed these riverbeds being too soft for any vehicular travel. Every manoeuvre by the Commonwealth forces was then thwarted by Legion mechs and vehicles that suddenly sliced through them by travelling on concrete hard stream beds. After splitting Commonwealth forces in 2, Colonel Kirita used his numerical superiority in mechs to an advantage. A week later, the gulf between the now northern Commonwealth forces and the southern, which had most of the Lyran mechs, was too large to overcome. A huge weather front then moved in, with tornadoes and gale-force winds, which grounded Lyran fighters for the first 2 weeks of this offensive. It was a gift from nature that Kirita had used to his advantage, placing Commonwealth fighter bases high on his target list. By the time the storms had broken, the Lyrans had lost more than half of their fighters, either to storm damage or to the legions of Vega. December saw the 14th and 2nd Legions of Vega further widen the gap between the divided 3rd Lyran Guards. The 2nd Legion and 20 infantry and tank regiments were pushing the 1st and 3rd battalions of the Commonwealth Mech Regiment, along with 6 tank and infantry regiments, toward the southern edge of the Great Desert of Tears. The desert's edge was as effective as any wild sea in denying an army a chance to escape to the north. The pursuing 2nd Legion of Vega was then relying on the shifting sands to slow the Commonwealth troops. In the south, the 14th Legion and the 14 accompanying regiments were pursuing the 2nd Battalion and Lightning Company of the 3rd Lyran Guards, along with 4 other regiments. The Commonwealth mechs stood up to the Legion, but couldn't cope with the tanks and infantry, which fought with a spirit that surprised the Commonwealth soldiers. Colonel Theodore was responsible for this renewed spirit and vigour in the combined troops. He encouraged his men to do better. He taught them to fight smarter and to use what they had to their best effect. Supplies were no longer a problem because the Curetans' offensive was so swift and unexpected they'd overwhelmed several Commonwealth supply depots. Curetan troops even tricked a commercial dropship that was working for the LCAF to land at a space fort that they'd just overrun. By mid-December, the 1st and 3rd battalions of the Guards were in danger of being completely surrounded near the desert's edge. Fearing annihilation of the unit, Lieutenant Colonel Brian Kincaid, acting commander at the time, decided to retreat off Vega. Though his decision probably did save the lives of his men, many in the Commonwealth called Colonel Kincaid's retreat an act of cowardice. Other LCAF units were also retreating in other areas, but Colonel Ulyosha Donovan, commander of the 3rd Lyran Guards, disagreed violently with Kincaid's decision. She believed that her 1 battalion of battered mechs would be able to prevail somehow and reunite with the rest of her regiment, and when she received word of Kincaid's retreat, she at first attempted to fight on despite the odds, but finally, after considerable pleading by her men, Colonel Donovan agreed to follow the rest of the regiment in retreat. When the two were reunited later, Colonel Donovan vented her anger at Kincaid, publicly calling him a coward for retreating, and said that he could have completed a suborbital drop behind the 14th Legion. That would have been extremely dangerous, of course, considering the violent winds and the growing confidence of the Legion's aerospace fighters. Whether by act of cowardice or just common sense, Vega was lost to the Commonwealth. Follow-up invasions. Though Lyran forces were bogged down on places like Buckminster and Vega, the unexpectedly large gains elsewhere prompted the Archon, on the 21st of October, to authorize her troops to exploit their success. Most of the jump ships that had participated in the first phase of the offensive had remained at the enemy star systems and were ready for a new advance. Reserve jump ships and commercial jump ships were ferrying occupation troops from the Commonwealth to the worlds that had been seized in the first assault, as well as serving as replacements for the invasion jump ships that had broken down. Though the Draconis Combine was a little more prepared this time, it was no less shocked at the sheer audacity of the Lyran Commonwealth Armed Forces. As one of the operation's objectives was to damage the DCMS and force Luthian to commit its reserves to this invasion, many Commonwealth RCTs pursued the opponents that they'd faced in the first phase, hoping to continue inflicting casualties. The exploitation phase of Operation Gotterdammerung had gained the Commonwealth 14 more Combine worlds. Some, like the Edge and Orbison, were worlds of great economic or political importance. Others, like Hainfeld and Gummium, though not as important, were emotional victories because they had long been Commonwealth worlds ages before. Despite these successes, though, the LCAF were growing tired. Though the many civilian transports that were borrowed by the military were ferrying in an adequate supply of ammunition, food, and replacement troops, they couldn't bring rest to the Commonwealth troops, many of whom had now been fighting around the clock. With the fatigue came a return to the old tactics and old distrusts. Inter-service squabbling was breaking out between regiments in the RCTs, and since the Commonwealth had only recently adopted this system of grouping regiments together, the Lyrans weren't skilled at handling questions of priority and seniority. Political posturing was worsening the situation as well. The Archon's enemies were using the feuding to spread doubt and lies to other troops. Most disturbing to the Commonwealth generals, though, was that the Draconis forces had recovered from this initial shock and were fighting much better and exacting a higher toll. While the LCAF still managed to push them off 14 worlds in this phase, it was more because they hadn't given the DCMS troops the chance to dig in. No longer was the Draconis Combine thinking defensively here. The 3rd Deeren Regulars, stationed on Kessel, counterattacked on Kimball II, a world that was under siege by 2 battalions of the 4th Sky Rangers. The now outgunned Rangers had made a fight of it, even though the attack had been unexpected, and this surprise attack worried Lyran generals because the whole thrust into the Lyran military district of the Combine was turning into a failure, and in danger of becoming a weak point. The military bureaucracy of the DCMS and the egos of some of its more important officers were preventing the Combine from taking advantage of these weak points. The feud between Colonel Kurita and General Cherenkov, commander of all the forces in the Lyran district, had kept the Combine from attacking the Commonwealth at its most vulnerable spot. In the Razelhag district, some commanders still considered the Commonwealth invasion the exaggeration of Mies Kurita, and others were so fearful that they just kept their reserve regiments to protect the worlds deep in the interior instead of sending them to the front. For the Lyran Commonwealth, the exploitation phase was another success. They gained more territory and the hope for more still. Kirchbach. Kirchbach was a prefecture capital and was a major target for the exploitation phase. It was also where the 5th Amphigean Light Assault Group and Helmut's Hermits had retreated. Also on Kirchbach was a 2nd mech regiment, the 17th Razelhag Regulars. This mass of forces tempered the Commonwealth's optimism. General Troka asked for and received the super-secret mech regiment to help him. General Troka led the 4th Donegal Guards, the 3rd Lyran Regulars, Winfield's Brigade, and the secret regiment on to Kirchbach. The secret regiment here was the Tier Battle Mech Regiment, its huge assault mechs painted dark blue and bearing seals of the Tier, the underground movement, which was gold with a Viking helm above the silver star that represented the Razelhag Principality. Piloting the mechs were members of the Tier underground movement, or men and women whose ancestry had strong ties to the Principality of Razelhag. And in its first engagement, the Tier regiment routed the entrenched 17th Razelhag Regulars at Östersund. News of this appearance sparked revolt amongst the planet's predominantly Scandinavian, and spontaneous riots and strikes were combined with planned sabotage by the Tier underground to paralyze the planet to make the Combine defenders feel as if they were now fighting on enemy soil. With the 17th Razelhag Regulars mauled by the Tier regiment and the 5th Amphigean Light Group, and Helmut's Hermits already weakened, the DCMS had little choice but to abandon Kirchbach. Most of the remaining forces would escape, but not before General Kelly Benziger, commander of the 17th, would commit suicide. End of the offensive. Capturing 14 worlds spurred on the Archon to continue to exploit the enemy weak points. Invasion forces would easily seize Mozarige, Atria, and Imbros, which had no major mech units to defend them. The Lyran Commonwealth did get into trouble though when General Nondi Steiner, who by this time was in almost complete control of the offensive, ordered her troops to continue pursuing Combine forces in hopes of catching and crushing them. The strategy did create two major problems for the Commonwealth though. It forced wounded troops to make another drop into hostile territory, and it prevented the LCAF from preparing for Combine counterattacks, which did come in December and January. The Draconis Combine attacked 6 worlds, 5 that were taken during the offensive, and 1 inside the Commonwealth itself. The 25th Razelhag Regulars dropped on the edge and took on the 10th Donegal Guards. The 9th Pest Regulars and the 13th Razelhag Regulars invaded Stanzak to attack the 12th Donegal Guards, who almost had to abandon the planet until they were reinforced by the 8th Donegal Guards. The 14th Donegal Guards, while trying to subdue the last of the militia resistance on Utrecht, were themselves attacked by the elite 7th Sword of Light. Bringing 20 infantry and armour regiments with it, the 7th had actually hoped that its mere appearance on Utrecht would persuade the Commonwealth forces to leave. They were badly disappointed then when Colonel W.J. Hardy, commander of the Guards, used the Sworders' arrogance to lure them into a series of ambushes that evened the odds considerably. Still, the Donegal Guards were on the tip of an unsteady thrust into Combine territory and were vulnerable. The 4th Sky Rangers and their supporting regiments were split between 2 worlds and under attack on both. The 3rd Lyran Regulars attacked the Rangers' 1st and 3rd Battalions, which had been attempting to subdue Kimball II. On Kornethros, the 17th Benjamin Regulars would attack the 2nd Battalion and the Lightning Company of the Rangers, and while the Rangers on both worlds did hold their own, they were caught divided, which hurt their effectiveness and their pride. When Barrett's Fusiliers forced the mercenary Kingston Caballeros off Sabic during the initial invasion, they didn't expect to see them again anytime soon. Both mercenary units had sustained heavy damage, and Commandant Alonso Barrett had assumed that the Caballeros would take quite a while to recover from the fight. He was wrong. The Caballeros had retreated to the planet Moore, where they had a large cache of replacements and supplies, and they had technicians who were waiting to rebuild their mechs. The Caballeros returned to Sabik in much better shape than the Fusiliers expected, and they lost half their forces and were reduced to a single battalion before Commandant Barrett ordered a retreat. But the most threatening action taken by the DCMS during the final weeks of 3028 was the invasion of the Steiner world, Labion, by the veteran 4th Proserpina Hussars. That regiment, along with 18 lesser units, discovered a hole in the Commonwealth front and promptly exploited it. Labion had only a battalion of aging militia mechs and 20 infantry and tank regiments to protect it, and they proved no match for the Hussars and their troops. The transition from offensive to defensive wasn't good for the Lyrans. The LCAF had gained 6 worlds: Unsmacht, Merzerige, Skokie, Ueda, Atria and Imbros III, but it lost Vega, Altenmarkt, Kelberai, Sabik and Labion. And more importantly, the LCAF were mired in long, costly campaigns for 9 other worlds against opponents that had totally recovered from the initial shock, and were making the Lyrans pay for this bold offensive. On the edge, the 10th Donegal Guards were now fighting the less experienced but now fresh 25th Rasalhague Regulars. On Lietzen, Winfield's brigade was fighting the Altenmarkt militia. On Engadin, the exhausted 26th Lyran Guards faced the St. Cyr Heavy Assault Group and remnants of the 5th Sunjang Academy cadre. The Tier Regiment and the 8th and 12th Donegal Guards squared off against the 9th Pest Regulars and the 13th Rasalhague Regulars on Stanzak. Mobile Fire and Bad Dream were taking on 22nd Rasalhague Regulars on Gunzburg, and on Utrecht, the 14th Donegal Guards were facing the elite 7th Sword of Light. On Shiratori, the 3rd Donegal Guards were fighting against the 3rd and 1st Proserpina Hussars, and on Buckminster, the 3rd Royals and the 20th Arcturan Guards had the upper hand against the 2nd Sword of Light and the 6th Arcab Legion. Meanwhile on Kimble and Corneferos, the split 4th Sky Rangers were facing the 3rd Deeren Regulars and the 17th Benjamin Regulars. Fatigue was becoming a problem. Unlike the Capellan campaign, where the AWFS had leapfrogged its forces to give the troops some rest, most frontline Commonwealth units had been fighting for at least 4 months straight. Often the only rest that they got was inside their cramped dropships as they waited for button-up and drop order. Their fatigue was showing on the field, with poor performance and terrible decision-making. The innovative tactics learned by the LCAF were giving way to the old, ineffective routine. The various branches of the service were once again quarrelling amongst themselves. Brute strength rather than finesse was once again characterized in the offensive and defensive maneuvering, and while sometimes it was effective in defense, an attack that relied on mass instead of intelligence rarely succeeded. Only the special lightning companies continued to use the deft tactics of maneuver and speed. The Tier Regiment and the Elvinder proved their worth. Both had done so recently, as the Tier in an amazingly quick assault on the Stanzak city of Gossel, and the Elvinder cracking the Crimson Turret, which was a combined stronghold outside Buckminster City. Those were the only 2 bright spots in a now darkening picture. Supply was also becoming a problem. The hundreds of freighters ferrying back and forth to the front lines were thrown into confusion by Commonwealth defeats. 6 civilian vessels being captured by the Draconis Combine during the offensive, prompting the crews of other civilian vessels to threaten a strike action unless the LCAF could guarantee their safety. With Lyran troops already reeling, they could hardly protect the crews, even though the entire transportation and supply system was on the verge of collapse. The political situation was worsening. The presence of enemy troops inside the Federation of Sky enraged Aldo Lestrade, who had taken every opportunity to berate the Archon and Operation Gotterdammerung in general. The open opposition was only a fraction of the political wrangling that was going on behind the scenes in Tharkad and Sky, and on the front lines. Because of the worsening situation on the Combine front, the Archon ordered a halt to any new offensive actions by mid-January of 3029. While some die-hard optimists and militarists did question her courage, most of the LCAF heaved a sigh of relief. Instead of trying to push deeper into the Combine, the Archon ordered her sister to consolidate Lyran gains and concentrate her few reserves on the remaining contested worlds.